Hi everybody, and welcome to the channel.
So there is a famous quote attributed to the philosopher Georges Santayana, which goes, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And I'm sure that there is nobody who would actually disagree with that, because they're wise words indeed. But I would change them slightly to say those who have never learnt the past are condemned to repeat the mistakes of the past. And although I'm sure that we can all agree with that, the truth is that most of us are shockingly terrible at taking that piece of advice on board. Now, there is a point in history which I find very illuminating for an awful lot of our problems today, and that's the Great Stink of 1858. For those who don't know, the Great Stink of 1858 is when a particularly hot summer stopped the River Thames in London from flowing, and the whole thing just boiled into a miasma. Okay, that wouldn't really have been a problem apart from the hundreds of years of neglect that preceded it. Around that time, London was a quickly growing city with people flocking into it, and the support structure for the necessities of life just weren't keeping up with the growth in population, particularly in respect of the provision of drinking water and sanitation. People brought with them their old ways of doing things, so in a village you went and got your water from the river, and for your sanitation, well, you dug a pit in the bottom of your garden. For translation into the city, these pits were often dug in basements or at the bottom of the garden, and the waste went in there. But of course London was a city, so there was an awful lot of industry, and that industrial waste was put on top of domestic waste, and so we got a huge amount of waste and no real plan on how to deal with it apart from chuck it in a pit. And to be honest, that kind of worked until the advent of the flushing toilet. Now, the flushing toilet was invented in 1596, and it was first patented with Alexander Cummings in 1775, but it was during the 1800s that it became amazingly popular. So with the growth of population and the fast adoption of the flushing toilet, of course, a pit in your basement couldn't cope with all that waste and water, and it basically flowed out into the streets and soaked the ground in excrement. The streets basically had channels, open sewers dug along them to take this overflow, but it wasn't long before the entire city of London was basically buildings sitting on a swamp of cess. The overflow was directed into the River Thames, working on the theory, well, the Thames flows out to the sea, so it can flow out to the sea and we can forget about it. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. The Thames is tidal, and so there was a backwash effect. And for basically hundreds of years, all of this stuff just collected in and around the bridges and wharfs and riverside of the River Thames. And of course, the situation got worse and worse as the city grew, leading to tremendous health problems, with several disease outbreaks running across the whole of the midpoint of the 18th century, including cholera outbreaks in 1832, 1849, 1854, and 1858, which carried off 23,000 people in that year alone. And it was mostly because people were drinking the water that contained their own excrement. And the usual story is that this all ended because of the wonderful work of Joseph Bazalgette, who built the Great Victorian Sewers. And although that is true, one might wonder why nothing had been done before. Well, I would argue that's because of our propensity to be able to ignore a problem until it bites us in our backsides. And 1858 represented a confluence of events. Like I said earlier, there was a particularly dry and hot summer, and this dried out the river and boiled all the sewage into a terrible devil's brew of stink and infection. In fact, it was so bad that people who were caught downwind of it would vomit in the streets. Queen Victoria is reported to have taken a boat trip that lasted 2 minutes because the smell was so bad. She ordered the boat to turn around so she could run away from it. She tried to survive it by pressing a bunch of posies tightly against her nose. But I would suspect that nothing would still have been done had it not been for the opening of the new Houses of Parliament, and of course these were right by the river and couldn't be moved because of the expense and the unpopularity of it. When Parliament sat, the smell was so bad they tried to combat it by soaking the curtains in disinfectant, but this clearly wasn't going to work, and so they ordered Bazalgette into action. The moral I get from this story is that nothing would have been done because it doesn't really matter if the poor die in their tens of thousands as long as the wealthy and the powerful are not slightly inconvenienced. And I think this story has so many parallels that we can draw between the Great Stink of 1858 and the problem of electric cars today. Now that might seem like a wild and crazy thing to say, but have a think about it for a second. We talked about changing conditions, that is the growth of population in the urban area and the introduction of a new technology, the flushing toilet. And we have exactly the same thing, the growth of population and the introduction of a new technology, the electric car. The flushing toilet was meant to improve life, but because the rest of the infrastructure around it didn't improve to cope with it, it led to a much greater problem. And with the increase in car adoption, with many families owning now 2 or 3 cars where they used to own 1, and the lack of infrastructure to support electric vehicles, that problem isn't getting any easier. The lack of infrastructure for vehicles doesn't extend only to charging points, which countries are busy banging in wherever they can. It also goes to the repair, maintenance and insurance of these vehicles. For various reasons, like legislative requirements on storage and training of technicians, the repair and maintenance of electric vehicles is vastly more expensive, and it's claimed that electric vehicles are 25.5% more expensive to repair and take 14% longer, with electric car vehicle insurance having soared by 72%. What this points to is a lack of basic infrastructure to support the electric vehicle. Of course, that's during the lifetime of the vehicle, but there's also a lack of infrastructure for end of life. It's said quite often that EV batteries can be recycled, and that's perfectly true, they can. However, the percentage of EV batteries that are currently recycled is 5%, and that's set against 95% of lead-acid battery recycling. The reason? The infrastructure isn't there. If you look at Tesla's new Model Y battery, the entire battery pack is filled with foam, meaning that battery disassembly and recycling is going to be even more expensive, which is probably why only 5% is recycled, although it's claimed that they can all be recycled. The claim is that an EV battery will last 10 years plus, with Tesla saying that the battery will last longer than the lifespan of the car. But given the high insurance cost, more EVs are written off earlier than petrol-driven cars because of the cost of replacing them or mending them after an accident. Now, when you look into the average age of a car, you'll find that the average age is given as the life expectancy of a car, and the life expectancy of an electric car is usually given as sort of 12 to 15 years, of a petrol car 10 to 12 years. But to be honest, that's a little disingenuous to my mind, because the average age of a car in the UK is 8.7 years, that's cars on the road, and the average age of an electric vehicle in the US is 3.8 years. So though the vehicle's expected to last longer, the truth is they just don't. They end up being scrapped after 3.8 years. Now, I'm by no means attempting to demonise the electric car. What I'm saying is that the electric car doesn't solve a problem, what it does is move a problem. In the same way that the internal flushing toilet didn't solve a problem, it moved a problem from the chamber pot under the bed to the street outside the door, and the electric vehicle does a very similar thing. When you listen to all the arguments pro and con about CO2 reduction, end of life, recycling, waste disposal, manufacturing and raw material availability, I think you begin to realise that it's not really a question of is an electric vehicle a good or a bad thing, but more, are we ready for electric vehicles? Both in terms of the infrastructure in place and the way we approach personal transportation. And I think to a degree, just like in London in the 1800s, the answer is pretty obvious. Just don't drink your own excrement and handle your waste properly. And if we can learn to do that, then I think we'll be ready for electric vehicles. But equally, if we learn to do that, we probably won't need to buy electric vehicles. And of course, there are very simple things we can do right now to obviate the need for that purchase. And it's quite simply drive a little less. And keep your car for maybe a year longer. Don't be so driven by vanity purchasing which predominates in the automotive industry. And perhaps the final lesson that can be pulled from 1858 is that change will only happen when the rich and powerful decide it will happen. And by that, I don't mean individuals, I mean the rich and powerful nations. If the individuals in the rich and powerful nations suddenly decide that perhaps they didn't need to drive as much as they do, or perhaps they didn't need as brand spanking new a car as they think they do, then real change will happen. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and thank you very much for watching.